The killer's name is Tyler James Robinson, just 22 years old, a college student with a twisted fixation hiding behind the mask of ordinary life. But inside his phone, prosecutors say, was a trail of darkness, texts to his roommate, who was also his boyfriend, spelling out his intentions. He wasn't confused. He wasn't unstable. He was deliberate. He hated Charlie Kirk's pro-life convictions. He despised his unrelenting opposition to the woke agenda infecting our schools, our culture, and our politics. And when Robinson entered that turning point event, armed and ready, he carried more than just a weapon. Investigators discovered the bullets were engraved with mocking anti-fascist slogans. One read, "Notices bulge woo," a cruel inside joke aimed at Fox News. These weren't just bullets. They were political messages carved in metal, fueled by years of rhetoric that painted conservative leaders as enemies of progress. But here's the question we must ask. What kind of environment radicalizes a 22-year-old to believe killing a patriot is some form of justice? To find the answer, we need to trace Robinson's path step by step through his cover-ups, his digital trail, and the voices that egged him on. Because as prosecutors revealed, this was not an accident of circumstance. It was a lone wolf groomed by a culture of hate. And the very first cracks in that cover-up appeared within hours of the shooting. When the first shots rang out inside the Turning Point USA event hall, chaos erupted. But almost as quickly as he pulled the trigger, Tyler Robinson tried to cover his tracks. Investigators say that within hours of the murder, Robinson began crafting lies, deleting messages, and even attempting to stage his story as if he were merely a bystander caught in the fray. That kind of cold calculation is exactly what Utah County Attorney Jeff Gray called out this week on Fox News. Gray didn't mince words. He called it an American tragedy. And he described Robinson's attempts at deception as the mark of someone not only guilty, but fully aware of his guilt. And yet, despite those cover-up attempts, the evidence was overwhelming. Forensic teams recovered the engraved bullets, each one carrying a spiteful political message. They traced Robinson's texts, where he spelled out his hatred for Kirk's pro-life stance, his mockery of Christian nationalism, and his bitterness toward conservatives who dared to stand with President Trump. These were not vague expressions of discontent. They were direct declarations of motive. By September 16th, just 4 days after the assassination, Robinson was indicted on 3 charges: aggravated murder, obstruction of justice, and felony discharge of a firearm. The indictment was swift because the case was airtight. The killer had essentially signed his own confession in the messages to his roommate. But here's the chilling part. Prosecutors say this wasn't just rage against one man. It was political rage, weaponized by the echo chamber Robinson lived in. So what voices, what influences could drive someone so young to believe the death of a conservative leader was justified? The answer, as testimony on Capitol Hill revealed today, is even darker than many expected. This morning, Washington turned its eyes to Capitol Hill, where Kash Patel sat before a House committee and delivered testimony that sent shockwaves through the chamber. Patel, a former Trump advisor and relentless investigator, laid bare what investigators uncovered in Robinson's private correspondences. Emails, group chats, and hidden forums painted a disturbing portrait. A young man immersed in radical leftist ideology, drowning in a digital sea of hatred for anyone aligned with Donald Trump. Patel revealed that Robinson wasn't just spouting off about politics, he was obsessed. He fixated on the language of resistance, of so-called anti-fascism, and of gender ideology. Records showed Robinson embraced radical trans ideology circles that celebrated confrontation and vilified conservatives as enemies to be removed. None of these groups plotted with him directly. Prosecutors made it clear there is no broader conspiracy. But Robinson's digital fingerprints prove he was a lone wolf whose mind had been saturated with one poisonous message: conservatives don't deserve to live. Think about that. A 22-year-old, raised in America, convinced that silencing voices like Charlie Kirk's was righteous. This wasn't just murder, it was an act of political warfare. And Patel drove the point home, warning Congress that when rhetoric from mainstream outlets paints every Trump ally as a threat to democracy, unstable young men like Robinson see violence as the solution. But that raises a haunting question. How much responsibility falls on the politicians and media figures who spent years demonizing Charlie Kirk and others like him? Because as Utah's own leaders began to respond, the truth became undeniable. The left's rhetoric has crossed the line, and America is paying the price. In the aftermath of Charlie Kirk's assassination, leaders across Utah and the nation stepped forward to speak, and their words revealed just how deep this wound cuts. Utah's governor, Spencer Cox, a Republican who has often spoken of unity, didn't hold back. He called this murder a symptom of a nation poisoned by division. Cox warned that when political rhetoric paints opponents as enemies instead of fellow citizens, tragedies like this are the inevitable result. Congressman Ken Calvert echoed those warnings. He reminded Americans that Charlie Kirk wasn't just a commentator, he was a builder, a young man who mobilized thousands of students to think critically, defend free markets, and challenge the suffocating orthodoxy of the left. Calvert declared that Kirk's death was not simply the loss of a friend, but a wake-up call. If Democrats continue fueling hostility, he said, this won't be the last time we see political violence aimed at conservatives. And the proof of that hostility was literally etched into Robinson's bullets. Engraved slogans mocking Fox News, mocking Christians, mocking pro-life Americans. They weren't random carvings. They were the physical embodiment of the talking points blasted day after day on left-wing airwaves. It was hate, crystallized in metal, fired in cold blood. The prosecutor's indictment makes clear Robinson acted alone, but the motives? They were anything but isolated. They were nurtured, emboldened, and weaponized by a culture that celebrates silencing conservatives. Which brings us to the most disturbing layer of this story, the killer's mindset in the hours leading up to the attack, a mindset revealed in messages that prosecutors say will haunt the courtroom for months to come. Hours before he carried out the assassination, Tyler Robinson's phone lit up with a series of chilling texts to his roommate and boyfriend. These weren't frantic spur-of-the-moment outbursts. They were calculated, deliberate, and written with the kind of conviction only hatred can fuel. In one message, he mocked Charlie Kirk as a mouthpiece for fascists. In another, he bragged that he would make his statement loud enough for the whole country to hear. Prosecutors say these texts erase any doubt. This was premeditated murder, fueled by ideology, not impulse. Investigators also found he had scoured news articles, podcasts, and social media feeds in the weeks prior, gathering talking points and justification for his plan. Every bit of it pointed in the same direction, left-wing media painting Kirk and other conservative voices as existential threats to society. Robinson didn't see Charlie Kirk as a man. He saw him as the villain in a story written by the radical press. But the most telling evidence came from the way Robinson spoke about himself. Friends described him as someone who felt invisible, resentful, and desperate to be noticed. Killing Charlie Kirk was his twisted way of becoming somebody. And when you combine personal emptiness with political rage, you get a cocktail that explodes into violence. Yet the story doesn't stop at motive. What prosecutors are laying out now is how Robinson tried to erase his trail, spinning a web of lies that crumbled almost immediately. And the details of that attempted cover-up exposed not just guilt, but a shocking coldness that stunned even veteran investigators. The cover-up began almost the moment the smoke cleared. Investigators say Tyler Robinson didn't flee in a panic. He tried to reinvent the story. He deleted messages off his phone, wiped certain search histories, and even attempted to spin his presence at the Turning Point USA event as nothing more than coincidence. But the lies collapsed quickly under the weight of forensic evidence. Utah County Attorney Jeff Gray told Fox News that Robinson's actions showed an astonishing level of coldness. Gray pointed out how Robinson had crafted excuses in advance, telling his roommate he'd claim self-defense if caught. Self-defense, after sneaking in bullets engraved with anti-conservative slurs. It was as if he thought he could murder a man in plain sight and walk out untouched, shielded by the same excuses radicals use when chaos erupts in the streets. But Robinson underestimated two things. First, the skill of investigators who pieced together his every move, and second, the power of truth. Ballistics matched his weapon. Engraved shells were found at the scene. His texts formed a timeline of intent. and his attempts to erase them only reinforced prosecutors' case. By September 16th, the indictment came down hard: aggravated murder, obstruction of justice, felony discharge of a firearm. This wasn't the profile of a confused youth. This was a calculated assassin, a product of ideological extremism. But the larger question still looms. How did Robinson's political worldview grow so poisonous that he believed silencing Charlie Kirk was his path to purpose? The answer lies in the cultural drumbeat he consumed day after day, and in the dangerous narrative that painted patriots as enemies. Step back and look at the bigger picture. Tyler Robinson didn't wake up one morning and suddenly decide to murder Charlie Kirk. His path was paved by years of rhetoric that demonized conservative voices. Think about the language we've heard: threats to democracy, extremists, fascists. When repeated enough, those words stop sounding like political disagreements. They become justifications for action. Robinson absorbed it all. Prosecutors revealed he binge-watched clips of left-wing commenters mocking pro-life Americans, smearing Trump allies, and ridiculing faith-based conservatives. He wasn't just listening, he was internalizing. By the time he walked into that turning point event, he believed he wasn't just killing a man. He believed he was striking a blow for a cause. That's how deep this indoctrination runs. And here's the irony. Charlie Kirk had dedicated his career to fighting precisely this kind of radicalism. Through Turning Point USA, he gave young Americans a voice against the wave of woke ideology drowning their campuses. He urged students to think for themselves, to embrace free markets, to defend the Constitution. He wasn't calling for division. He was calling for dialogue. And for that, he was targeted. So what does it mean when standing for traditional values can cost you your life? It means America is at a tipping point. This isn't just about one killer. It's about a climate of hatred that radicalizes the vulnerable and weaponizes the bitter. And when Congress heard Kash Patel's testimony, that climate was laid bare in ways no one could ignore. Because behind Robinson's attack was a network of ideas that should terrify every American who cares about freedom. Kash Patel's testimony ripped the mask off that network of ideas. He detailed how Robinson's online history tied him to fringe communities steeped in anti-conservative rage, places where violent rhetoric wasn't just tolerated, it was encouraged. These weren't official organizations plotting together, but echo chambers where young radicals fed each other the same poisonous narrative: that conservatives, Christians, and Trump allies weren't political opponents, but oppressors who had to be taken down. Patel warned Congress that Robinson's case should be seen as a flashing red light. He was a lone wolf, yes, but not a lone thinker. His words, his bullets, his motives, they mirrored the talking points repeated daily by mainstream left-wing voices: the obsession with labeling patriots as fascists, the fixation on tearing down pro-life leaders, the hostility toward faith, tradition, and even the very idea of America itself. Robinson's fingerprints may be his own, but the script he followed was written for him by a culture of contempt, and what Patel emphasized struck a nerve. The left is quick to shout about radicalization whenever it sees a conservative with strong convictions. But here, with blood on the ground, the evidence of radicalization is undeniable, and it came from their side of the aisle. Still, some try to dismiss it, to call this an isolated act. But can we honestly believe that when a 22-year-old engraves political slogans onto bullets and hunts down a conservative leader? That's not isolation. That's indoctrination. And the way Republican leaders have framed this tragedy exposes just how dangerous the denial has become. Republican leaders wasted no time drawing the line clearly. Governor Spencer Cox reminded Americans that words matter, that when leaders and media voices frame conservatives as enemies of progress, someone eventually takes that language to its darkest conclusion. Congressman Ken Calvert went further, warning that the assassination of Charlie Kirk is proof of what happens when Democrats fuel a culture of division and violence. This wasn't just an attack on one man. It was an attack on the very right of conservatives to speak freely without fear of death. Charlie Kirk stood for something that terrified the radical left: influence over the next generation. He filled college halls, arenas, and churches with young Americans hungry for truth. He defended the unborn, he defended free speech, and he defended President Trump when it wasn't easy. That influence made him a target, and now his murder has become a chilling warning to anyone who dares to push back against the woke agenda. But what makes this story resonate even deeper is the way prosecutors describe Robinson's calm cover-up, as if he believed his actions were justified, even righteous. That coldness is the legacy of a movement that's convinced too many young people that patriotism is something to be ashamed of, that Christianity is dangerous, that dissenting from leftist orthodoxy is a crime. So the question isn't just how Robinson was radicalized, it's how many more are out there being radicalized right now. And that leads us to the final piece of this tragic puzzle: what this assassination means for the future of America and how we choose to respond to it. Charlie Kirk's death is more than a headline, it is a crossroads for America. On one side is the path that produced Tyler Robinson, a culture marinated in contempt where the left paints every conservative as a villain until someone decides violence is the answer. On the other side is the path Charlie himself walked: courage, conviction, and a willingness to stand in the arena for faith, freedom, and the future of this nation. Utah County Attorney Jeff Gray said it plainly: this was an American tragedy, but it's also a warning. Because if we don't recognize the cost of demonizing patriots, if we don't understand how poisonous rhetoric becomes a weapon in the hands of the unstable, then Robinson's act won't be the last. Republican leaders are right to call this out for what it is, a product of Democrat-fueled division. But they're also calling for something more. Governor Cox urged Americans to reject the idea that disagreement makes us enemies. Congressman Calvert insisted that honoring Kirk means recommitting to the fight for conservative principles, not shrinking back in fear. And Kash Patel reminded Congress that the danger isn't just one assassin, it's the climate that made him believe murder was a political statement. Charlie Kirk's legacy will not be erased by a lone gunman. If anything, his voice now echoes louder. He stood as a patriot in life, and in death, he has exposed the price of America's division. The question left for all of us is simple: will we allow the radical left's hate to define the future, or will we unite behind the values Kirk championed: faith, family, and freedom, so that his sacrifice was not in vain?